And more national news. It was 53 years ago last week, Ohio National Guard troops confronted anti-war protesters at Kent State University, opened fire on the unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9 others. The 4 killed were 19-year-old Allison Krause and 20-year-olds Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Scheuer, and William Schroeder. They were part of 300 students who came to protest the April 30th announcement by President Richard Nixon the Pentagon was expanding the Vietnam War with an invasion of Cambodia.
Tonight, American and South Vietnamese units will attack the headquarters for the entire communist military operation in South Vietnam. This key control center has been occupied by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong for 5 years in blatant violation of Cambodia's neutrality. This is not an invasion of Cambodia. The areas in which these attacks will be launched are completely occupied and controlled by North Vietnamese forces. Our purpose is not to occupy the areas. Once enemy forces are driven out of these sanctuaries, and once their military supplies are destroyed, we will withdraw.
Artist Mike Alewitz is based in New London, Connecticut, but in 1970 he was deeply involved in the anti-war movement.
Well, I was a student at Kent State. I was a student leader. I was chairman of the Student Mobilization Committee Against the War, which was the largest anti-war group on campus. And I was a socialist activist. And I was active before the shootings took place. After the shootings took place, I was part of the Committee of Kent State Massacre Witnesses, which we traveled around the country. At that time, you had to go somewhere to give a report on something. This was many years pre-computers. And we were basically involved in trying to extend the national student strike that began with the invasion of Cambodia and the shootings at Kent. Up to that time, it was the largest political demonstration of its kind that had ever happened in the United States. Over 400 universities and colleges were occupied. It was an amazing event that had a profound effect on people of my generation.
What led up to Kent State, and remind people of the history?
The war in Vietnam, which was a holocaust for the people of Southeast Asia and for the many thousands of U.S. and people of my generation who were drafted and forced to fight in Southeast Asia. Over the many years of the war, the hatred of it grew. People were opposed to the war. Those of us involved in the anti-war movement were reaching out to the Army and to workers, unions, whatever, along with building a base on campus, to build a movement that would end the war. We were being very successful in doing that. For the first time in history, there was a massive anti-war movement involving millions of people organized against the war. People hated the war. So the hatred of the war grew. Then Nixon was elected president because he said he had a secret plan to end the war. What he did on April 30th of 1970, he went on TV and announced the invasion of Cambodia, a sovereign nation, and a dramatic extension of the war. Demonstrations broke out all over the country. At Kent, there were a series of events and protests that led up to the massacre on May 4th. Nixon called the students bums. James Rhodes, the governor of Ohio, echoed that kind of thing, whipping up a vitriolic kind of hysteria against student protesters. That's what laid the basis for the shootings on May 4th. The ruling class, government and its arrogance, felt that if they repressed the movement, people would be afraid and go away. But of course, the opposite happened. The shootings were a spark that led to even more massive demonstrations than we'd ever had before, and went deep into the army, the working class. It really was a turning point in the anti-war movement.
Many hundreds of campuses were protesting. Why did a shooting happen at Kent State?
We don't know these things. We know that Rhodes, there was exchanges with the White House. A lot of these kind of events, and this has been something that's been an issue at Kent, because there are a lot of people who try to say, well, it was the guardsmen. Of course, guardsmen pulled the trigger, but really the decision to do something like this does not happen at the local level. It certainly doesn't happen without people like the local authorities, the governor, whatever, having exchanges with national authorities. And we know there were phone calls back and forth between Rhodes and the White House. They made a decision to provide a framework for this to occur. It was pretty much a foregone conclusion. And the reason I say that is because I'd been involved in a lot of demonstrations. And the demonstration on May 4th, 1970, was a peaceful gathering. It's a warm spring day. The guardsmen had been called in to occupy the campus on specious events.
Ohio State had a riot because their football team had won, and they did a lot of damage there, much more than anything that happened at Kent State.
Yeah. What they did at Kent was they burned down the ROTC building, which was a dilapidated structure that was basically like a big chicken coop. And then they used that as an excuse. That day, it was very clear this was unprovoked.
They said they were throwing gravel and pebbles at the National Guard.
Yeah, it was nothing compared. Your example is very good. Football riots that take place on hundreds of campuses are much more severe than what happened at Kent. What they wanted to do was to make the movement go away, and they thought that if they took these kind of actions, it would happen. This same kind of thing is going on today. I would, for example, the events that are going on in Atlanta, where there's the movement to stop Cop City. The cops went in and they just shot up this kid who was one of the forest defenders.
Tortuguita.
Yeah, and was obviously unprovoked. And then they were having a concert, and they went in and they arrested people who were attending on terrorism charges. This kind of thing, in my opinion, was not a decision of some people in Atlanta. It was clearly something that was decided upon by people on a much higher pay grade, so to speak. They consult on these things before they do them. They thought that if they do this, if they attack the movement in Atlanta, that people who are mobilizing against the militarization of the police, that if they do this, people will get scared, and that'll be the end of the movement.
Let's go to that day, May 4th, and the story that there was a police infiltrator who was armed, an informant within the provocateur, within the demonstrators, who was armed and was seen with a gun and with talking to the National Guard's people during this. Is there anything to that story?
Oh, yes. There's photographic evidence, and it's all been documented in different legal ways. Guy's name was Terry Norman, and he was an FBI informant. And there are pictures of him handing a gun to a cop. He had a handgun on that day. Now, there's different speculation about whether he was being a provocateur, whether he had fired shots. The real problem is that he has never had to account for himself. Here's an armed FBI agent at a time when all this stuff about government spying and provocations, he never had to answer for any of this. Mm-hmm. And the school and the state authorities and the national government have done their best to suppress the real history of what happened there and to cover up the events of May 4th.
There's no accountability, right?
The person who's been heading up the official commemorations for the past few years is Stephanie Dane Smith, who was one of the top CIA officers that worked with Condoleezza Rice in instituting the torture campaigns in Iraq. That's who was organizing the commemorations, which have evolved largely into this kind of semi-militarist thing, where it's been depoliticized. They don't talk about the anti-war movement. It's like some abstract tragedy. What we have here is a misunderstanding, a failure to communicate.
A car crash on the highway with some students.
Some of the ex-radicals from SDS have been used and have built careers and accommodated themselves to this stuff. The actual events at Kent have been largely presented in a very fictional way. they don't talk about the mass anti-war movement. We had demonstrations of thousands of students on the campus before the shootings. There was all kinds of anti-war activity, the Student Mobilization Committee, the Kent Committee Against the War, and there were other groups. We've been written out of history. They don't mention it. Allison Krause was active. She was an anti-war protester. Sandy Scheuer participated in anti-war activities. Yet they always say that, oh, no, they were just victims. They weren't actually people who had anti-war positions who felt very strongly about things. On the 50th anniversary, Bill Schroeder, who was in ROTC, but who was out there protesting, they tried to make it look like he was an ROTC guy, like he had some loyalty to the Army or something. They've really tried to rewrite the history of this thing. And that's true about the anti-war movement in general. They've really tried to very consciously misrepresent the movement. All these myths about people spitting on soldiers. They put these movies out like the Rambo things. Sylvester Stallone says this stuff. It was the anti-war movement that was supporting the GIs. Our slogan was support the troops, bring them home. I was very involved in organizing GIs. After the shootings at Kent, I was in Texas, near the military bases, and we were helping to organize GIs at Fort Hood and Bergstrom Air Force Base in San Antonio. It was the soldiers. This is another thing that's been written out of our history. It was rank-and-file soldiers. It was an organic movement within the Army, led mostly by Black and Latino soldiers, who organized and ended the war by refusing to fight. Basically, the Army began to collapse in Vietnam, and that's when they were forced to withdraw the troops. It was the determined resistance of the Vietnamese people, the heroic resistance to U.S. imperialism, and the soldiers who were won over to the anti-war movement, who very bravely began to resist the war. That's how it ended. It didn't end by some liberal politicians doing it. That's not how change happens. Change comes from working people.
Artist Mike Alewitz is based in New London, Connecticut. In 1970, he was involved in the movement against the Vietnam War. Attorney Stanley Cohen was a young anti-war activist in 1970. He says the protesters at Kent were doing their duty on behalf of the victims of United States imperialism.
The takeaway from Kent State, the takeaway from our resistance against imperialism and aggression and occupation in Vietnam and Cambodia and Latin America, and you go right up the list, is that you always support the occupied, never the occupier. You always stand for righteousness and justice, and that doesn't mean making excuses or rewriting what is going on or crafting denial. It means standing with those women and men and those children and those elderly whose lives are being destroyed, whose homes are being bombed, whose future is being denied. And not because it's some sort of abstract theoretical paradigm, because it's reality. And what you must keep if you're going to be consistent with your principle is keep an eye, and when you begin to make excuses and to step 2, 3, 4 moves away to rationalize support for imperial design and for occupation, you need to take a look in the mirror, because you are no longer with the occupied, but with the occupier.
Kent State is an example of the blood, that song, Find the Cost of Freedom, right?
I remember it as if yesterday. There were millions of people in Southeast Asia who paid the price for in-your-face, very clear violence and aggression and imperial design. And there were millions of Americans who paid a price in supporting and standing with them, whether it be by our arrest, our imprisonment, our becoming, quote, fugitives, our becoming expats, our lives being altered. Principle never requires leaps in logic.
To be stereotyped as a certain type of person because of how you stood in those days, and you can't shake it to this very day.
You never measure your success in life as a principled human being by those that love you, but rather by those that hate you. It's a core of my life that has kept me going through very difficult times, and I've been targeted for violence and assassination and targeted by the government, and indeed went to prison for, quote, impeding the IRS. And was the target of a 15-year investigation for material support of terrorism that went nowhere, and that's when this popped up. You have to be consistent. The numbers of people that I have come across over the years who basically rewrote the call of their life, who years ago were resisting wars of aggression and violence and were fighting for domestic justice and against imperial design, who walked away. And rather than simply acknowledging that they weren't up for the fight, they rather say they grew up and realized the mistakes of their youth, which is just disingenuous and dishonest. There are certain core values, certain core fights, certain core principles, whether it's acquired or whether you're fortunate enough to be born with them, you take with you until the time you become ashes unto the wind. And you don't cherry pick your fights. You don't make righteous calls to right away to excuse or to justify the imperial designs of anyone anywhere, from the United States to Russia to Israel. You are either fighting for justice or you're fighting against it.
Attorney Stanley Cohen. In the following years, Guardsmen were indicted for their roles in the shooting, but eventually civil rights charges were dismissed. Courts later ruled an order by the university banning protests was legal. Former Vice President Spiro Agnew admitted in a TV interview the Guard had committed murder, but it was justified by over-response in the heat of anger. The sister of Allison Krause, a student killed by one of the 67 or so bullets fired by Ohio National Guard troops, is Laurel Krause. She discussed the shooting on May 4th on the podcast By George, hosted by George Clark. Krause says the shooting was started by a known police agent.
Named Terry Norman, I was not there. This is what I've been able to put together. He brought out his pistol. It was shiny, one of those nickel-plated pistols. And the sun, it was shiny. It was a beautiful day, big billowy clouds, gorgeous day. And the sun ricocheted off the pistol. He pulled it out, and the students attacked him and started punching him. And the reason why I know this is because there was a recording. Someone on their dormitory ledge was recording the whole event. And this preceded the massacre. And they hear him you can hear the fists landing against Terry Norman. And Terry Norman manages to get away from the crowd, even though they're attacking him. And I've seen pictures of it, so I know it really did happen. And he manages to get away, and he runs and he shoots off his pistol 4 times. Now, the Guardsmen at this point are marching up the hill, and they're almost marching beyond the peak because he had been waylaid when the students attacked him. But he managed to get it off. He shoots his pistol. The guard then says, someone in the guard who's not wearing a gas mask, there's only a couple of them that aren't wearing gas masks, gives the command to fire. And he says, all right, guard, to begin the fire, the command. And the command is not by any military standard whatsoever. All right, guard, command, ready, set, and then the fire, and so they turn all in unison because they were going up this hill away from the students. They all turn in unison. They all shoot in unison. So obviously that proves that there was a command. You can't all turn in unison and shoot in unison.
That's critical.
Without that.
Yeah.
They didn't have the same thought in their head, as my mother says. So basically, that's what happened with the Kent State. The first shot was Terry Norman, FBI informant, provocateur, and then the Guardsmen then shoot. They shot to kill. It was with M1s, with bullets that explode upon impact, very illegal. My sister had a portion of that in every organ of her body.
These assault rifles today, and I talk about this on my podcast all the time. You talk about being struck by bullets. It's like being struck by a pop can. I mean, that's what these rifles are intended to do. They're not intended to wound or bring down assailants. That's not what they're intended to do. They're intended to blow you apart. And that's what they do. In fact, I want to bring this.
And shoot for 2 miles, and so there were shot elements everywhere.
Laurel Krause is the younger sister of Allison Krause, one of 4 students at Kent State protesting the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. On May 15th, National Guard troops opened fire at mostly black University of Mississippi, killing 2 students, both African American. And that's the news for the week of May 5th, 2023. The news is produced by this reporter. You can hear the news every Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern on the Progressive Radio Network, prn.live, or at my website, pauldirienzo.com. From New York City, I'm Paul DiRienzo. Thanks for listening.